as DHS and the FBI ramp up a statewide crackdown. Federal prosecutors say that the total fraud in Minnesota could ultimately be more than $9 billion.
6:47 a.m. on a cold February morning in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The numbers that followed were staggering. $19 billion in fraudulent pandemic relief funds. Over 400 kilograms of fentanyl trafficked through Minneapolis in the last 18 months alone. 17 state legislators, 9 federal immigration officers, and 1 sitting United States Senator implicated in a scheme so vast it turned the Twin Cities into a cartel-controlled hub for narcotics distribution, human trafficking, and migrant smuggling operations stretching from East Africa to the Mexican border. This is the largest political infiltration by a drug cartel ever documented on U.S. soil. And what you're about to hear is just the surface. Because the deeper federal agents dug, the worse it became. It started at 4:11 a.m. on a frozen January night in South Minneapolis. The streets were empty. Streetlights reflected off icy pavement. A thin fog rolled through the neighborhoods near Cedar Riverside, where old apartment complexes stood shoulder to shoulder with shuttered storefronts and late-night convenience stores. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees. No one was outside. But beneath the silence, over 200 federal agents were moving into position. FBI, ICE, DEA, DHS, SWAT teams from 3 jurisdictions. They wore black tactical gear and moved like shadows through alleyways and parking garages. Their targets were spread across a dozen locations. Underground money transfer houses, fake community nonprofit offices, cartel-run logistics warehouses disguised as halal grocery distribution centers, human trafficking safe houses where migrants were held before being moved to labor sites across the Midwest. And at the center of it all, a private office complex in Bloomington that looked like any other business park but functioned as the nerve center for a $19 billion fraud empire. At exactly 4:17 a.m., the raids began. Flashbangs exploded through reinforced doors. Glass shattered. SWAT teams poured into darkened hallways with rifles raised and night vision glowing green. In one warehouse on the southern edge of the city, agents found rows of shrink-wrapped packages stacked floor to ceiling. Fentanyl. Over 200 kilograms of pure fentanyl powder, enough to kill millions. In another location, they found methamphetamine bricks stamped with cartel symbols and heroin packages ready for street distribution. Suspects scrambled. Some tried to run with duffel bags stuffed with cash. Others reached for weapons. Gunfire cracked through the cold air. Federal agents returned fire. Within minutes, the suspects were on the ground, hands zip-tied behind their backs, faces pressed into frozen concrete. But it wasn't the drugs that made agents stop and stare. It was what they found in the back office of the Bloomington complex. Encrypted servers. Rows of hard drives sealed in fireproof cases. Ledgers written in a mix of Somali, Arabic, and coded English. Financial documents showing wire transfers moving through shell companies in Kenya, Dubai, Turkey, and Minnesota. And then, in a locked steel cabinet, they found something that made the lead FBI agent call Washington immediately. A tablet with encrypted communications between cartel logistics coordinators and someone identified only as the senator. The messages detailed shipment schedules, border patrol shift changes, and federal audit evasion strategies. This wasn't just a drug operation. This was command-level political collusion. By 9:32 a.m., the seized devices were in the hands of FBI cyber forensics teams at a secure facility outside Minneapolis. Analysts worked in a room lit only by the glow of monitors, cracking military-grade encryption layer by layer. What they uncovered was a network so complex it had taken years to build and had evaded detection by operating in plain sight under the cover of pandemic relief programs and immigrant community aid organizations. The operation had a code name buried in the encrypted files: Operation Prosperity Bridge. It sounded charitable. It was anything but. Federal investigators traced the money flows and found a web of over 40 shell companies and ghost corporations. Fake nonprofit foundations with names like New American Opportunity Fund and Midwest Refugee Relief Network. Sham logistics firms. Restaurant chains that existed only on paper. The money moved in carefully disguised transfers, routed through offshore accounts in the UAE, routed again through Turkish holding companies, then clean-washed into U.S. banks through fraudulent COVID-19 relief claims, small business loans, and federal child care assistance programs that didn't serve a single real child. The scheme had siphoned $19 billion from American taxpayers. And at the center of it all was a woman named Senator Amina Khalid, a fictional Somali-born legislator who had risen to national prominence as a champion of immigrant rights and social justice. Her digital signature was everywhere. Encrypted authorizations for fund transfers. Emails coordinating with cartel logistics managers about migrant smuggling routes through the southern border. Internal messages directing corrupt ICE officers to delay deportations for certain individuals who were, in reality, cartel members and human traffickers operating under false asylum claims. Senator Khalid had used her position on the Senate Homeland Security Committee to access classified enforcement schedules, which she then leaked to cartel operators, allowing drug convoys and human trafficking networks to move undetected through Minneapolis, Chicago, and Detroit. She had turned Minnesota into a secure northern hub for a transnational drug empire that stretched from Mogadishu to Mexico City. This was not corruption. This was engineered treason. And federal agents were just getting started. At 5:48 a.m. the following day, a joint federal task force assembled inside a command center at the Minneapolis FBI field office. The room was cold and dimly lit. On the far wall, a massive digital map glowed with over 60 red markers pulsing across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, and as far south as Texas. Each marker represented a location tied to Operation Prosperity Bridge, cartel safe houses, fraudulent business fronts, human trafficking transit points, migrant smuggling hubs, money laundering nodes. The network was massive. The operation that morning involved over 900 federal agents, 18 SWAT teams, 6 Black Hawk helicopters, and armored units from DHS and IC. Air support included surveillance drones and 2 U.S. Army reconnaissance planes circling the region to track any suspects attempting to flee across state lines. The mission was clear: dismantle the entire network in one coordinated strike before anyone could destroy evidence or disappear. At exactly 6:02 a.m., the raids began. In St. Paul, federal agents stormed a 3-story apartment building that had been converted into a human trafficking processing center. Inside, they found over 40 migrants locked in rooms with boarded windows, forced to work off fabricated debts to cartel handlers. In Bloomington, agents hit a logistics warehouse where fraudulent pandemic relief checks were printed and distributed to fake identities. In Rochester, they raided a sprawling rural property where methamphetamine was repackaged for distribution across the Midwest. In Chicago, ICE agents intercepted a convoy of refrigerated trucks carrying fentanyl pills hidden inside shipments of frozen halal meat. Over 2.1 million fentanyl pills were seized in that single stop. Back in Minneapolis, SWAT teams breached the offices of a nonprofit called the Unity Migration Fund, which had received over $300 million in federal grants. Inside, agents found no migrants, no services, just rows of desks with computers running automated fraud software, generating fake claims and fake identities to siphon taxpayer money into cartel accounts. In the basement, they found more narcotics: cocaine bricks stamped with cartel symbols, heroin bundles wrapped in plastic, and a small room filled with assault rifles, body armor, and cartel insignia patches. By noon, the task force had seized over 600 kilograms of narcotics, $47 million in cash, 230 fraudulent identities, and arrested over 120 suspects, including cartel members, corrupt nonprofit directors, fraudulent business owners, and compromised government officials. The underworld took more damage in 6 hours than it had in the last 6 years. But the worst discoveries came when investigators began analyzing the seized servers and internal communications. They found logs showing that 18 IC officers, 9 Border Patrol agents, and 5 state-level immigration judges had been on the cartel payroll. These officials received monthly payments ranging from $15,000 to $75,000, transferred through encrypted cryptocurrency wallets and fake consulting contracts. In exchange, they delayed deportations, approved asylum claims for known criminals, and leaked federal enforcement schedules to cartel coordinators. One email, sent from Senator Khalid's encrypted account, read, "Ensure convoy clears MSP checkpoint by Thursday 3 a.m. Patrol shift rotates at 2:50. Window is tight." That convoy carried 300 kilograms of methamphetamine. Another message directed a corrupt immigration judge to approve asylum for a man federal investigators later identified as a high-ranking member of a Somali organized crime syndicate with direct ties to Mexican cartel distributors. The judge received $50,000 2 days after the approval. Honest federal agents who had worked these cases for years felt betrayed. One ICE supervisor, a veteran with over 15 years of service, sat in a conference room staring at the evidence and said, "I thought we were protecting the border. I didn't know half my team was working for the other side." Federal agents arrested a senior ICE deputy director in his own office. They arrested a Minnesota state immigration coordinator at her home in front of her family. They arrested a federal grants administrator who had personally approved over $2 billion in fraudulent pandemic relief claims, all of which flowed directly into Senator Khalid's network. What investigators realized was chilling. This was not just a compromised agency. This was a parallel enforcement system, a second, secret layer of authority that operated within the government but answered to the cartel. Senator Khalid had built it piece by piece, appointment by appointment, using her influence, her public image, and her access to federal systems. She had turned a U.S. Senate office into a cartel command center, and she had done it while cameras praised her as a voice for the vulnerable. The system would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. But the network didn't stop at Minnesota's borders. When federal analysts expanded their investigation, they discovered that Operation Prosperity Bridge had interstate and international logistics that dwarfed anything they had seen before. The fraudulent relief funds didn't just stay in the US. They were wired to accounts in Kenya, where they funded migrant smuggling operations that moved people from East Africa to South America, then north through Central America and Mexico, and finally into the United States through cartel-controlled border corridors in Texas and Arizona. Once in the US, many of these migrants were forced into labor, trapped in debt bondage, or used as drug couriers. The cartel behind the operation was a hybrid network. It combined Somali organized crime syndicates with Mexican cartel infrastructure, specifically elements connected to distribution cells that operated in the Midwest. This alliance allowed the network to move narcotics, money, and people across 3 continents with brutal efficiency. Somali operatives handled the fraud schemes, identity theft, and East African logistics. Mexican cartel members handled the drug supply chains, border crossings, and enforcement. Together, they built an empire worth $19 billion. Federal agents discovered that the network moved an estimated 800 kilograms of narcotics per week through a combination of long-haul trucking routes, shipping containers routed through the Port of Houston, and fake agricultural shipments. Manifests were altered by corrupt logistics coordinators. Way stations in Iowa and Nebraska were conveniently closed for maintenance when convoys passed through. Human trafficking victims were hidden in the cargo holds of refrigerated trucks, sometimes for days, with little food or water, transported like freight across state lines. And then investigators found the final file. It was buried deep in Senator Khalid's encrypted drive, protected by 3 layers of passwords. The file was titled Phase 3, Institutional Permanence. Inside was a 20-year strategic plan to turn the Twin Cities into the permanent northern headquarters for transnational cartel operations. The plan detailed how to place operatives in law enforcement academies, how to fund political campaigns for candidates who would protect the network, how to lobby for federal immigration policies that would create legal cover for smuggling operations, and how to use community organizations as recruitment and money laundering fronts. The goal was not just to infiltrate the system. The goal was to become the system. One line from the document read, "By 2035, enforcement will not be our obstacle. Enforcement will be our ally." That was the vision. A shadow government embedded so deeply in democratic institutions that it would be untouchable, invisible, and unstoppable. But they underestimated the resolve of the honest agents who refused to look away. Power does not always need violence. Sometimes it only needs silence. It needs people to look the other way. It needs ambition disguised as compassion and corruption wrapped in the language of justice. Senator Amina Khalid built her empire not with bullets, but with paperwork. Not with threats, but with titles. She used the very systems designed to protect the vulnerable to exploit them. She turned pandemic relief into cartel funding. She turned immigration assistance into human trafficking infrastructure. She turned a Senate office into a drug empire command post. And the cost? The cost was measured in lives. Fentanyl from her network killed over 2,000 Americans in the Midwest alone. Families destroyed. Mothers who buried their children. Fathers who found their sons dead in bathrooms with needles still in their arms. Entire neighborhoods in Minneapolis swallowed by addiction, violence, and despair. Human trafficking victims who came to America searching for hope and found only captivity and exploitation. Honest law enforcement officers who spent years chasing shadows while their own colleagues worked for the enemy. This story is a warning. It is a warning that infiltration does not always look like an invasion. It looks like opportunity. It looks like progress. It looks like justice until the mask comes off and you see what was underneath all along. Operation Prosperity Bridge was not an anomaly. It was a blueprint. And if we do not pay attention, it will be replicated. If you are still watching, tap like so more people see this story. Share it with someone who needs to understand how deep corruption can go when power is left unchecked. Comment expose if you believe these systems need to be dragged into the light and rebuilt with accountability. This is not a left or right issue. This is not about one party or one community. This is about the integrity of the institutions we trust to protect us. And when those institutions are compromised, none of us are safe. Remember, this story is a fictional dramatization created to illustrate the dangers of political corruption, organized crime infiltration, and the abuse of public trust. But the themes are real, the tactics are real, and the threat is real. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop asking questions. Because power without accountability does not sleep, and neither can we.